Welcome back, everyone. For our final lesson on Beethoven, today we're going to talk about one of Beethoven's most important final works, the String Quartet number 14 in C-sharp minor, Opus 131. This is a great example of Beethoven's late period or third period. So we've been talking about the division of Beethoven's career into roughly three sections. The second or middle period is sometimes called Beethoven's heroic era. And this is when he was writing a lot of large-scale public sort of works, including the Eroica Symphony, the Fifth Symphony, and so forth. But as we move into the final years of Beethoven's life, his compositional output dwindled quite a bit. He was still composing incredibly powerful works, but rather than thinking of them necessarily as large-scale public statements, instead he began to write music that was much more personal, intended for professional listeners, for connoisseurs, and for the composer himself. As a matter of fact, in the final 12 or so years of Beethoven's career, he only composed two large-scale public works, the Missa Solemnis and the Ninth Symphony. Beethoven had always been attracted to the genre of the string quartet, even though he himself was a pianist, because of the expressive possibilities that were present in that genre. The writer and poet-playwright, about whom we're going to talk in much more detail next week, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, once described the string quartet as four sensible persons conversing. And that's the way we tend to think of it when we look at the string quartets of Haydn or Mozart. But with Beethoven, we certainly see some of those elements, but we see Beethoven doing a lot of the same kinds of experimentation in his string quartets that he was doing in his symphonies and his piano sonatas. So we don't have time, of course, to talk about all of the string quartets, but just to give you a couple of highlights. So from the early period, Beethoven's best-known collection of string quartets are the six quartets of Opus 6. Again, drawing on the model, especially of Haydn, his former teacher, but going beyond what Haydn did in terms of dissonance and in terms of expressive capabilities of what the string quartet can be. The three quartets of Opus 59, known as the Razumovsky quartets, named after the Russian ambassador to Vienna, who was a very fine amateur string player and actually had his own quartet. So Beethoven did some interesting experimental things in that quartet as well. And to give you an example, I wanted to play just a little bit of the opening of the first movement of Opus 59 number 1 in F major. One of the things that you're going to notice from the beginning is that Beethoven creates a fairly rich sound, and in many parts of these quartets, he's actually imitating the richness of a symphony orchestra by using only four players. But one of the most innovative things of the Opus 59 number 1 that you'll hear from the very beginning is that the first theme idea, the first thematic statement, is given to the cello, not to the first or second violin. So the upper strings are actually doing the accompanying while the melody is in the lowest string part. So that is something that is very unique. So here is just a little bit of the opening of String Quartet Opus 59, number 1. Big sound. A lot of listeners and audiences were very puzzled by these pieces, by the sudden harmonic changes, by the sudden changes of dynamic, for the fact that we don't always know where the melody is, we don't always know where we are in terms of the form. So these are the kind of things that Beethoven is going to really exploit in his final set of string quartets, the late quartets. So the one we're going to be looking at, Opus 131 in C sharp minor. So this is a piece for the final exam. So the work is unique in a couple of different ways. First off, rather than using the traditional 4 movements that we would expect, the fast, slow, minuet, fast structure, it's 7 movements, played without pause. So the term for that is attacca. We're going to see later composers like, say, Robert Schumann and others who are going to draw on that, Felix Mendelssohn, are going to write large-scale works that include movements that are played without pause. But in the string quartet, it was virtually unheard of before Beethoven. The first movement opens not with the sunny, cheerful sonata form that we would expect, but instead it opens with a fugue. But not just any fugue, and I'll talk about that more in just a minute. The opening movement also is dominated by the musical material that is presented originally in first violin and then answered by the other parts, just like we expect in a traditional fugue. This subject not only dominates the entire movement, it's presented in all 4 parts in the original time durations, but also faster and slower, so what we call augmentation and diminution. And it returns later on in the symphony in altered form. So once again, another example of this term we've talked about before, cyclicism, the return of musical material in more than one movement of a multi-movement work as a way to tie the piece together. Beethoven marks this work, and it's number 127 in the anthology, marks this work Adagio, ma non troppo e molto espressivo. There had never been a tempo and expressive indication like that in a string quartet score, and really in most other types of pieces too. The fact that he is starting it slow with a fugue, and he's exceedingly precise in his notation. When you look at the score, you'll see this, indicating all these crescendos, all these changes of dynamics to turn this from a simple entertainment piece into a really very powerful, some would say, passionate statement, artistic statement. And so before we listen to a little bit of the opening of the first movement, I want to play just the subject by itself to give you an idea of the musical material that Beethoven is going to base this entire movement on. As a matter of fact, several of the pitches that appear in the first statement of the subject in Violin 1 are going to return in the later movements of the quartet and become tonic pitches for those later movements. So again, Beethoven is drawing the maximum possibilities that he can from the musical material that is presented at the very beginning of the work. Moving a little bit forward toward the end of the first movement, I just wanted to play a short passage which is indicative of the sort of harmonic experimentation that Beethoven was doing in these final pieces. So even though we're still ostensibly in the key of C sharp minor, the use of chromaticism and the complexity of the harmonies really call that into question. So here's just a bit of what I'm talking about. So listening to music like that, it's no wonder that Wagner was such an admirer of this quartet, because that kind of harmonic boldness, if you will, would provide a template for a lot of composers in the 19th century to draw from. So after the first movement, again, remember I talked about all the movements are presented attacca. So the first movement goes right into the second movement, which is a sonata rondo movement. The third movement is a brief transition. The fourth movement is a gigantic theme and variations, followed by a scherzo, very, very fast, very lively scherzo. So typical of a lot of Beethoven's works, especially in the late period, is their wild extremes of mood and character. Then a short sixth movement, followed by a seventh movement in sonata form, where he is able to turn that original melody sort of upside down, where it had originally been presented as a very beautiful lyrical melody, instead becomes stormy and dramatic. So here's just a bit of what I'm talking about. The opening of the final movement of the C-sharp minor string quartet. So by taking many of the traditional ideas of the string quartet that people would recognize, and when you look at the quartet as a whole, you can see, oh, okay, that movement is reminiscent of the scherzo, and that movement is reminiscent of the slow movement with theme and variations like we would see in music of Haydn, which is true. But in typical Beethoven fashion, he takes those established ideas and greatly expands upon them, really makes them his own, makes them unique. We also see in this work something that we find in many of his late period compositions. We see it in the Ninth Symphony, for example, is a real focus on counterpoint, in particular fugue or fugato, and theme and variations. That focus on those two styles, I would say that obsessive focus is something that is very typical of Beethoven's late career. I just wanted to close with a statement, or a word actually, from a longer statement by a contemporary Beethoven named Louis Spohr, who remarked that many of the quartets that Beethoven was writing in the final period of his life were incredibly difficult for people who were not educated musicians to understand. He called them indecipherable. And that certainly reflects the way that a lot of audiences received Beethoven's music in the final period of his life. But again, Beethoven thought of himself really as writing for his own muse, as writing music for the future generations that would hear it, not necessarily as a way to please audiences. Of course, today, his music is very much pleases audiences and performers because it requires a tremendous amount of skill to be able to pull these pieces off. But I just would close by saying that Beethoven, in works like the C-sharp minor string quartet, really provided a model, a template for the future of Romanticism and the next period to come. And so in our next unit, we're going to be talking a little bit about the rise of Romanticism, and especially in the hands of a composer who is a huge admirer and greatly influenced by Beethoven, and that is Franz Schubert. So more about Schubert in the next video. All right, thank you for your attention, and we'll see you next time.